When looking out over the silent misty moors, you wouldn't believe some of the secrets they hold. Like today's story of Winter Hill. Thursday, 8th of November 1838, and 20-year-old George Henderson stepped outside of the Old Cock Inn, on Manchester Road in the village of Blackrod. He had been forced to spend the night due to the weather and lack of daylight. George was a Scottish traveller from Annan, Dumfriesshire. He worked for Mr John Jardine, a draper with a business in Blackburn, as a traveller or packman as they were also known. George moved around the neighbourhood, stretching from Blackburn to the outskirts of Bolton, including the surrounding small villages, selling goods, taking orders, and collecting payments for the goods. It was his usual custom to make his way every other Friday back to Blackburn to report to his employer, Mr John Jardine. George rolled his shoulders, stretching his back as he looked out over the view in the morning light from the high vantage point of Blackrod. Thick cloud could be seen smothering the nearby moors of Horwich and Winter Hill. He bit his lower lip, studying the weather, as it was this general direction that George would be heading, as the regular travellers' route to Blackburn ran climbing up the moor and passing over the summit of Winter Hill, before descending to join the Bolton to Preston road near Belmont. George gathered his things, slung his pack over his shoulder, and set off with the constant tap, tap, tap of his walking stick on the ground. He was in a cheerful mood, and he wished good morning to some of the other packmen who were also getting ready to leave. George heard a voice call to him, with a thick Scottish accent.
"Would you care to wait for us?"
"Hey, pal," George replied.
"I'm meeting Benjamin at Garwood's, and I'm already late."
The fellow raised his hand in acknowledgement, and George carried on with his journey. About half a mile distance from the summit of Winter Hill, and along the left-hand side of the road, stood a group of terraced cottages, known locally as Five Houses, or Garbuts, after the owner of the cottages. There was brick and tile works and several local coal pits in the surrounding area. Garbut's own cottage also doubled as a beer house, which became a regular meeting place for both travellers and the local inhabitants of the area. And the packmen were also a common sight in the area during the 19th century, having migrated from Scotland to seek employment. They often settled in small communities in many of the towns of the northwest of England. One such area in Blackburn was known as Nova Scotia, or New Scotland, and it was a fellow Scotsman, Benjamin Burrell, himself a traveller from Blackburn and friend of Henderson, that had arranged to meet him this Friday morning on the 9th of November at 11 o'clock at Garbut's Beer House, as they were both due back in Blackburn on the Friday night, and had decided to have dinner together at the Black Dog Inn in Belmont and then travel back together. Benjamin had arrived at Garbut's Beer House an hour earlier than expected on the Friday morning, so at 10 a.m. Benjamin waited for George to join him until around 11, but when there was still no sign of George, Benjamin Burrell left Garbut's and left a message at the bar that George should join him later at Belmont for dinner. The stones of the path crunched underfoot. George was making slow progress. He removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked. George saw the sun high in the sky and knew he was falling behind, as he had been stopped a few times and had also several calls along his route. But in the distance he could see Garbut's beer house, and this spurred him on. When eventually he arrived at the beer house around 12 o'clock noon, he opened the wooden door and greeted Mr Garbut behind the bar, who told him Benjamin had been in earlier and had left a message for him. Then George sat down and ordered a glass of ale, which surprised Mr Garbut so much he asked George if he was okay. because according to Mr Garbutt, this was a rare occasion for the young Scotsman. When he finished his drink, George set out again and made his way up the road towards Winter Hill summit and on to Belmont. As George walked, he watched the wind dance through the heather. He pulled up the sack on his back, trying to get it to rest in a more comfy position. 15 minutes later, not far from the summit, just before the road descends through a gateway in the boundary wall known as the Stumps, George popped down his walking stick on a rock and relieved the call of nature into a ditch that ran along the road. But as he stood there, he thought he heard footsteps drawing nearer. He turned his head, but as he did, there was a loud sound that echoed through the valley, and everything went black. Benjamin arrived at the Black Dog in Belmont, where he and George had planned to eat together. Benjamin ordered their dinner and waited. But when George did not come, Benjamin went out in search for him. But while walking in the mist on the moors, he met a tall man in a shooting coat with a gun. Benjamin walked up the hill, and the man walked behind him. After proceeding a few yards, Benjamin happened to look behind him and saw the man was pointing the gun right at him, about 10 yards away. When he turned round, the man asked, did you see those birds?" But there were no birds in the direction which the gun was pointing. Benjamin hurriedly walked away, keeping an eye on the man. A little later he passed another man, and heard of the incident involving George. Benjamin rushed to the side of his friend. Soon after the incident had been reported, a group of men who at the time had been observed on the moors with guns were arrested on suspicion of being responsible for shooting George Henderson. However, further inquiries revealed that they were in fact an organised shooting party from Smith Hills Hall, and guests of the local landowner and magistrate Peter Ainsworth. However, attention was focused on a local collier, James Whittle, who lived with his parents in one of the cottages at 5 Houses on the Winter Hill Road. He was reported to have been seen on the moors that day with a gun. As a result, he was duly arrested on the suspicion of shooting and taken into custody. The body of George remained at Garbutt's for the post-mortem examination, and until the following Wednesday, when at 11 o'clock he was taken in a solemn procession for burial in Blackburn. An inquest into the death was held on Tuesday the 13th of November until Friday the 16th of November 1838 at the Moorgate Inn in Horwich, which is now the Blundell Arms. Mr Jardine, George Henderson's employer, said he was a young man of goodly appearance, pleasing in manner and of sober habits, and he was so much respected by all those who knew him. Such was the esteem in which he was held that Mr Jardine offered the reward of £100 for the apprehension of the person or persons responsible for the shooting. Witnesses were called, and the room heard that George Henderson was still alive when a young boy who was passing the spot heard moaning coming from the drainage ditch on the right-hand side of the road. He stopped walking. He did not venture to the spot because of fear what he might find, but he hurried to one of the numerous coal pits nearby to raise the alarm, returning shortly in the company of one of the local colliers. They both found the body of Henderson lying on his back in the ditch, half submerged in the water, having been shot through the head. All his pockets were turned out, and he was muttering, "I'm robbed, I'm killed." The time would be around 12:45 p.m, and with the assistance of other local men who had by now arrived at the scene, the victim was carried back down the road to Gabbett's Beer House, where he died of his injuries at around 2:30 p.m. It emerged from the extent of his injuries he suffered that Henderson had been shot at very close range, just below the right ear, from a matter of a few feet, with the shot passing straight through his head, with the force pushing out his eyes from the sockets. with one eye missing entirely. The brains came through the eye which was blown out. The cheek and under the ear was stained with powder marks, and his brains were lying scattered about the road, indicating a deliberate act rather than what was first suspected, a shooting accident. From the state of the certain items of the victim's clothing, robbery would have appeared to be a likely motive. The moors around the area were well known for game, and such. They would attract not only those with legitimate businesses there, but also poachers who would certainly have used the misty weather to their advantage. Mary Entwistle, a witness who said she heard shots fired and that morning saw Whittle with a gun shooting near her house, said he had the same clothes on at the time that he does now. She was sure that it was him, for she knew him well. She never saw anyone else with a gun besides him that day. And another witness, Mr Garbett, also said he saw Whittle nearby with a gun in hand, and also his wife told him that she had seen Whittle look through the window on Friday morning whilst the deceased Scotsman was still in the beer house. Mr Whittle himself said yes, he had seen the Scotsman and he was on the moor, but he had no gun. After witnesses had given their evidence and further enquiries completed, a verdict of wilful murder was returned against James Whittle, and he was committed to Kirkdale Prison, Liverpool, to stand trial at the Lancashire Lent Assizes at Liverpool in 1839. At the trial at Liverpool Crown Court on Tuesday, April 2nd, 1839, Whittle was described as about 22 years of age, 6 feet tall, possessing a dark, morose, unpleasant countenance. But he had a strong and athletic form. He has of late been a lawless, dissolute and reckless character, known for poaching. The coroner addressed the prisoner. Whittle, the evidence is now closed. Now is the time for you to say anything in your defence, or to call any witness to prove where you were at the time when this horrific transaction took place. Whittle protested his innocence, and he said he hadn't anything further to say. Then that he was home at the time when the alarm was given, and also at 5 houses at 12 noon, adding that his father could prove this. A proclamation for witnesses for the defence was announced, but not a single person offered to come forward. Mr Benjamin Burrell stated, when questioned, that when he arrived near the spot, a tall, white-looking young man dressed in blue clothes with a gun in his hand asked him, "Is there any game about here?" Burrell replied, "I believe there is." He then asked, "If you go with me a bit, you shall have the first that I kill." Burrell declined the offer, saying that he had business to attend to. After walking a few yards, he turned to see the man with the gun levelled at him, as if to shoot him, but he pretended to have been aiming at birds. Burrell proceeded to keep an eye on the man as he went. Immediately, the suspicion grew on Whittle, who was exactly the sort of person described in both dress and appearance. It is also said that Whittle formed an illicit connection with a young woman in the area, to whom it is said that he had been married in a week previous to the murder. A number of people, including Sarah Lomax, said they saw Mr Whittle near or coming from the area of the shooting, and over 11 other witnesses had damning statements. But all was not over for Mr Whittle, as his defence, Charles Wilkins and John Taylor, took over the trial, tearing apart witnesses and getting statements thrown out, pointing out that any evidence is just circumstantial, and this whole trial against their client was down to people chasing the £100 reward money. And in the end, Mr Whittle was acquitted and freed immediately. But many thought he had committed the murder, and when he went blind, people believed this was God's punishment for his crime. But this murder was never solved. That'll about do it, but to let you know, Winter Hill and nearby Rivington Moor are familiar landmarks to the locals of Horwich and Bolton that lie in the valley below. Winter Hill is some 1,475 feet above sea level, With a view to the northeast are the slopes of Pendle Hill, known far and wide for its hauntings and the witch trials, and further still are the outlines of the Yorkshire Dales that can also be seen. I also find it strange that this mystery woman that Whittle is said to have a clandestine relationship with from the local neighbourhood. There is no other details that are forthcoming, and she was never called upon by either the defence or the prosecution as a witness at the inquest or the trial. Could she have something to do with the murder? Was George seeing her? Was there some kind of lover's tryst? Had George Henderson himself struck up a friendship with the woman during his travels, and Whittle or someone else found out and decided to seek revenge? After Whittle's acquittal, the person or persons responsible for this brutal killing were never found, so the mystery continues. The spot where Henderson met his death was originally marked by a small tree, which over the years was gradually stripped by souvenir hunters. The site is now marked by a single old water pipe erected in 1912. This site is locally known as Scotsman's Stump, where it bears the following inscription: in memory of George Henderson, native of Annan, Dumfriesshire, who was brutally murdered on Rivington Moor at noonday, 9th of November 1838, in the 20th year of his age. Well, that'll about do it. But let me know your thoughts on this story. What do you think happened? Was this a massive mistrial of justice? Were these defence attorneys too much for local working class people? Was there someone else on the moor? Or did Whittle get away with murder? Well, that'll about do it. Thank you for your support. Take care.